What an incredible day of energy and conversation and a whole lot of collaboration across disciplines. It really is a nexus, I think, not surprisingly. My name is Nina Marie Lister. I've been asked to moderate a conversation among these incredible professionals who are, let's say, pushing boundaries, hopping fences, playing in ponds, maybe, or even building them that they haven't built before. I just thought it might be useful to reiterate some of the themes that I heard today. I got to listen, and listen I did. And I learned a lot as well. I learned a lot about ecosystems that I don't regularly work in, from the Platte River, the alluvial riverbed that is an inch deep and a mile wide, or at least we aspire to that. I learned about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and very expensive large capital cost infrastructure. I learned about Hudson Yards and the High Line together, seen through the lens of both landscape design and horticulture. And I also want to say that I think what I heard was many of the similar and same struggles, as well as learning opportunities that I see in my own practice. Collaboration across the disciplines is a really important theme, and it's one of the opportunities that we have for learning, not only as individual professionals, but as interdisciplinary taskmasters, you might say, of the design challenges ahead. So that's certainly one of them that was common to all of the conversations. Another one is maybe integrative design, designing across disciplines in a way that pulls together the pieces of good science that supports and informs those designs. And another is a way to make use of that information, perhaps in designs that we have not yet seen before, or permutations of those designs that are going to change over time. Another theme that emerges from that then might be the role of research. What do we learn from research as it informs design? Can we think of design itself as a kind of controlled, or in some cases, less than controlled experiment, an experiment in practice that evolves over time? And the final piece that emerges to me from that thinking, and what I heard you say in one way or another, is that there is some learning that can happen through mistakes that are made. And some might say that in the wrong context, it's learning through failure. In the right context, it's learning by experience through adaptation and monitoring, which frankly, I think a lot of our professionals are not able to do. Even if they're capable and wanting to do it, they're not always provided with the opportunity to do it. And this symposium has really allowed us to hear about some of those experiences firsthand. And I thought maybe we could have a conversation about each of those themes in some order that's probably going to end up randomized. But my ambition is to at least raise them. I also want to say to the group that I know that it's Friday night, and I know that the only thing standing between you and your weekend is us. So we want to make sure that it's a robust but somewhat controlled conversation, with an opportunity for some further questions from our audience, who, while small, is mighty and right in the center of things. So maybe first I could ask you each to comment a little bit on what you think are the single biggest opportunities in your collaborative praxis, we might say, and what are the biggest barriers? Not surprising, perhaps, but something that has certainly underpinned the conversation today.
It's almost the same answer. So the thing that unites us, I suppose, would be the problem. We all share a problem, like at the Platte River. We all want to see habitat being improved and whatnot. Is this thing on? Is it green? It's green now. So the problem is essentially what unites us. The thing that separates us is the solution, and that's where the collaboration has to come in. I mean, if that's pretty concise of an answer, but it really, I see this theme over and over and over in these meetings that we have where there's contention, and we all want to solve the problem, and we all are dedicated to it. We sit in the room and we hash it out and we solve it, even if there's two answers. And the solution to that is test them both, appease everybody. I mean, that's something.
I agree strongly with what he just said, Tom just said there, as far as the what draws everybody together is the problem. The Platte River program is focused on protecting water and the species for the 3 states in the basin, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming. We all have the same mission, the same goal, the same There's different approaches to getting to the end point. Like Tom said, and we address those through different experimental designs and test the different hypotheses, see which one comes out to be true or if either of them are true. The one way that the Platte River program has really drawn together collaboration is everybody that sits at our table on our governing body has the same voice. There's not one decision maker, one entity that makes the decision for us. It's everybody has an equal vote, and if it's not a unanimous vote, we don't go forward with the project. So that encourages collaboration. A lot of other large-scale landscape projects like ours, they are more driven by the Corps of Engineers or Fish and Wildlife Service, or a single entity makes every decision. They take input from everybody, but the one entity makes the decisions. So I think that's really helped collaboration in the Platte River program.
Yeah, for us and on Nicollet specifically, starting with the end in mind, having that common goal that everybody knows it's what we're working for. We had 3 distinct goals on what we were trying to achieve on Nicollet, and anytime a discrepancy came up or a conflict arose between the landscape architect and the contractor, we just looked back at those goals, and it was pretty easy to reset and get everybody back on track. I've been on other projects where we didn't have that real clear vision of where we're going as a team, and every time something came up, there was always this headbutting, and it just never went away. So,
I have 2 answers. I think the panel today demonstrated some really great collaborations, I believe ours. But specifically, the other one that spoke to me was yours, and just in terms of the challenges that we're having on the Hudson Yards project, which in some moments feel like opposing the contracting team. We work together very well in a lot of instances too, but I appreciate that as an example of the positive dialogue there. But then more broadly, not speaking about Hudson Yards in our practice, I think we always seek out opportunities to bring in other expertise. We know that as a profession, we're sort of generalists. It's almost not our job to have the expertise in any, in horticulture, in construction. But, for us, and we didn't talk about any of the other work that the firm does, but it will be historians and foresters, farming consultants, biologists. So I think being, knowing enough to know that you don't know it all, right? And looking towards the partners that you can build to make a more robust project. And I think it then gives you the opportunity to extend the message of your design work further, but not just your message. It becomes, a message that is expanded because of the people that are involved.
Thanks. One of the themes, we'll start with the challenges. We'll end on a hopeful note. One of the themes I always thought was interesting was the way you move through any day, how many green spaces you pass, and how many of those green spaces are civic spaces, and how are those spaces articulated, or are they not articulated? What could it have been versus what it is? And what role is the mere presence of the marketplace playing in the commoditization of what is functionally your community? It's not just the thing that you enjoy aesthetically, it's the thing that informs your the habitat that you occupy, right? So and not to pick, let me pick on civil engineers because everybody likes to. No, but if you're doing a detention basin the same way over and over and over again, and just cutting and pasting a schedule, right, and laying it over the top, and you're kind of perpetuating this real lost opportunity. So what is the opportunity? It's like, well, okay, we can say that we have more turf than we need, that we're using more chemicals than we need, that we have less diversity than is available to us, and that diversity is fascinating in its own way, right? We're impermeable where we could be permeable. We're not green enough in those ways. Our ground plane there's mulch that used to be pallets that is sold on the radio. It's a Home Depot opportunity for the spring season, right? So I don't think it's too Pollyannish to say that these transformative opportunities exist because they exist. You know, these community interventions really matter, and now if we can get people to sort of prize these professions as real things, that somebody who's taking care of something, one of these elements, right, is not just a person with a truck, it's a person who's providing real value. And you know, it's like any other kind of guild or special calling that has real value, and then our community is gonna pay for it because it's gonna pay back, you know, in the longer run. So if I was a student, that's the kind of work that I would want to do, right? And I'd want to, rather than populating shopping malls with Luraipi, right? I mean, that's a job, but you know, there are other opportunities. So that's what's inspiring, is hearing people wanting to do aspirational things in places where they live and in places they haven't yet seen.
For us, collaboration, I'd say, is a lot like the relationship with my wife. We we argue, we fight, we butt heads, and then at the end of the day, I put my foot down and we do whatever my wife wants to do. So, no, I'm just kidding. But you know, with MVA, a lot of it was just learning to trust each other. You know, we've talked about this. You know, this is such a high-profile, once-in-a-lifetime project for us, and maybe even for you guys. And so we really want it to be successful. And so we both have the same end goals in mind. And so just communicating and trusting each other that we're doing everything we can as a team to get there. So, you know, communication and trust was probably the biggest kind of lesson learned for our team. And then also kind of, you know, something we should have started probably earlier than we did in the process. So anyway, that's...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always nice to have new experiences with new consultants, just because I sort of feel like you can sometimes get in a rut. You know, you sort of know or are used to what the other person wants or is trying to achieve, and it can get very dull pretty quickly, right? If you're not pushing the boundaries constantly about what's possible. You know, we often pull in other consultants that are not part of the core project team, just to, you know, say, hey, what are we missing here? And they might not come to the table with the idea that ultimately gets executed, but it sort of pushes the boundaries of thinking beyond that. And my interests really lie in building landscapes. I'm tremendously interested in taking, you know, master planning ideas and coming up with executable concepts. And if it wasn't obvious from the presentation, I have a really special interest in stonework. And so rather than, you know, me trying to learn on my own, I spent over the number of years quite a lot of days and weeks with this quarryman upstate in New York, and have just learned a tremendous amount from him, and we've become like really good friends over the years. And it's just incredible because he knows the questions to ask local quarries about their capacity, their fabrication abilities, and everything to basically bring a design idea to life. And that's, you know, really where my interest lies. So I think that openness to kind of push the boundaries a little bit and those types of things.
I appreciated hearing about the boundary pushing. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Philip, because I was actually going to ask you a question.
Well, I was just, to be succinct and respond to your question, I think if we, to achieve resilient landscapes that are also engaging, I think that's the goal, and the what a collaboration may bring in our work. And I think the challenge, and I'm mostly just reiterating what I was discussing earlier, is, you know, how does that novel design, what is the lasting impact? Can it be lasting in highly used spaces? I think that's where it's, you know, the grapple becomes for me.
It's a nice segue, because I did hear the ideas that most of you have talked about are actually process functions of working together, how you do it, what you learn, and perhaps where one profession leaves off, the other picks up, and so on. But there's, of course, higher level collaborations that challenge us to push our boundaries intellectually, that perhaps we can achieve something that hasn't been done, and that when you raise the word resilience again in these conversations, we're all in new territory. We're in places that we don't necessarily know where we're going. with design work. We can't use that same drawing off the shelf again and again and again, particularly when we see evidence that it might not be working or might actually be contributing to a problem. And Philip, you said something very interesting in your presentation that stuck with me, and I'm wondering whether it has resonated with our audience as well. And you said that one of the challenges might actually force you to reconceive the role of urban forestry. And we might all see a role for ourselves in that question. Do these projects, particularly in new territories, challenge us to see our work differently? So if an urban forester, to use your example, is charged with caregiving and stewardship of the tree for life, what happens if that lifetime is shortened? What happens if the vegetation on infrastructure has a different lifespan? Or perhaps the soil volume simply won't allow growth at a particular range and size. That's just one example, of course. So I wonder if there are other examples, whether from the audience or the panel, that you might think of where the challenge is really esoteric, fundamental. It causes you to rethink your discipline. Or by the same token, to students here, or what you're hearing today, is it causing you to rethink what the boundaries of your discipline might be? So it's really a question to all of you that you yourselves have raised, I would like to say. Are we approaching challenges here that are forcing us to rethink the way in which we practice, the boundaries of our practice? I mean, the answer is probably yes, but how, maybe is the way I'd rephrase the question. How? Where are you seeing your practice come apart a little bit, come together with something else, or as students? What are you hearing here that maybe is changing what you thought about what your practice might be?
I mean, for me, one of the interesting things is the types of projects that landscape architects are starting to be leads on. It's just incredible. 15 years ago, you wouldn't think of a landscape architect leading a parking garage project, right? But there are fundamental things that make us feel better about walking through the built environment, like light and vegetation and things like that. And so I think that there's this tremendous opportunity to try to go beyond the traditional project, and now more than ever, I think we have an opportunity to kind of grab the reins of and be the lead on some of those things, because I think we're, as Serena said, we're generalists, and we're well suited to try to understand all of the inputs and develop smart solutions.
So I'm actually a fourth-year architecture student here, and I would say to that question that the whole segregation of the architecture, landscape architecture, and interior design starting second year until fourth year has been a benefit for that, because we can't know about everything. Getting very focused on a certain career field and trajectory, and then coming together fourth year and sharing what you've learned about landscapes or about architecture, and having those people work together really allows a different perspective that simply hasn't been achieved on one's own. Like having the addition of someone who studied architecture in a completely different way, in a more landscape way. I hear different things from them than I do from the other students of architecture. Makes me think about designing buildings in a different way. Probably makes them think about designing landscapes in a different way, and I think that's very helpful in that interdisciplinary way of learning.
Great, excellent point that the curriculum itself can actually foster that kind of integrative thinking.
I was going to add to that, not being afraid to ask questions that you don't have the knowledge to answer. For instance, and I'm looking at these timbers in this building, or your structure here, and we're working on a project. I've been talking about it because I'm excited about it. We just had a meeting last week in rural Mississippi that's in loblolly pine forest land. And we're taking the opportunity and uncovering more problems as we go, more complexities that we don't fully understand. But interviewing the local forester and thinking about the regional economics and trying to envision what a model could be for the future, because basically in that scenario, this loblolly is this monoculture, that was kind of market created because of like a government regulation that restricted crops and incentivized forestry, but it's had, it's caused sort of an economic slump in the region. Anyway, so we're trying to challenge ourselves to think about what the future of that landscape could be and what the regenerative potentials are in model forestry ideas. And, it's very uncharted territory for our firm, but we're seeking out, partners that could help us think through it and looking really to the region to make connections. So it becomes about bridge building, and it's definitely not what I thought I would be doing when I was in landscape architecture school working on design. But it's still the same toolkit in some ways, I think, that you learn in terms of, systems thinking and assessing a problem and thinking creatively about what the solutions could be, and applying, ecological knowledge about diversity and resilience that you have when you do things differently than kind of monoculture land. So I think that's just an example to challenge us to think outside of what we think we're traditionally capable of and just see where it takes us.
I mean, it's a great point about, not being afraid to say that you don't know, because in a collaborative environment, there's nothing worse than knowing that the person that you're working with just made something up, and you know it, and the person next to you knows it, and the other person does it, and it really disrupts the working relationship forever, in the sense that it's like, well, how often is that going to happen? That's not good. So that, ultimately, if you feel like, man, I really should know that, then just go home that night and start to figure it out. And then, you'll know it going forward. Because you end up on these, like you were saying, these weird deep dives, like we were trying to avoid using tropical hardwoods on the High Line, and we kind of looking at reclaimed stuff. So I did this kind of dive down, like reclaim wood, and that became interesting. And I'm not an expert in it, but I'm sensitive to it enough now to know what avenues to pursue. So it's just, it kind of gets you partway there. But to the point of, like, what you can do to grow moving forward as you're trying to figure things out is building in the time to do enough evaluation of not just your work, but other people's work, that you start to see patterns that advance you beyond the anecdotal. That you're not an expert because you went to this one place and you saw something growing and you saw it as some kind of finite oil painting that you're going to go remake somewhere, because it's more organic than that, right? So, and I don't do it. I mean, I do it, but I don't do as much as I need to do, because everybody gets busy. But you do want to see how things perform, what lasts, what goes away, and even in the sort of the natural world, whether it's a rural site that's just kind of coming into its own in really kind of interesting ways, or if it's some vestige of some natural community. There are lessons to be told there that require time. So, to the point of those azalea pictures before, I got stopped by not one, by two state cops in that same day taking those pictures. And both times when I told them, he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm taking pictures of these azaleas." They just drove off in silence. It's like, what could that possibly mean, right? So, getting out of the car, kind of hopping over some fences and looking at that stuff is really, I think, a valuable exercise.
This is completely out of my realm of expertise, but I was very intrigued today by the building in what I'm considering, I think this is the fourth dimension, building these greenscapes over top of existing features that aren't wastelands, but there's better uses or more uses for that territory. I think it's going to become growingly important as we move forward and the cities expand and the green spaces become more valuable. And to me, there's a lot more value in green space than just the aesthetics. I mean, I like the openness and just the feeling of being outdoors, I guess. So there's a lot of value in the spaces that may not be monetary, but are very important areas. So you guys are entering into an exciting career if you're in the landscape ecology stuff.
And to add to that, personal interest, right? I went into landscape architecture not because I was the super awesome designer. I didn't know a lot about design, honestly, or plant material for that matter. I was more interested in construction and construction detailing. And so when I got into the profession, that's what I was intrigued by. I wanted to work for a firm that was working on a more technical level, soils, irrigation, that sort of infrastructure level type work. And as I progressed in my career and I took the job offer with field operations and started getting in these construction administration roles where that's literally all I do for the office. And I would get into these positions on site very uncomfortable positions where I didn't know a lot about plant material. I didn't know a lot about horticulture, those sort of things, and I was forced to adapt to those situations and again admit that I didn't really know the answer to it, but I knew someone who would, and I could go back to our arborist that we had hired on the project or our horticulturist and get the answers that I needed to be able to provide that to the landscape contractor. So again, we all have our own personal interests in why we're pursuing the career in landscape architecture, and yeah, so.
I wonder if our audience has questions that are related to this or another theme that we haven't mentioned that you'd like to ask about. I mean, this is your opportunity to ask the panel and to feel like it's a real moment where you can have some of that conversation. Don't be shy. But I do need to hand someone a mic, I think. So I need to borrow one.
You want to go ahead?
Go for it.
Okay, I'll go first. All right. Yellow, is that right? Okay, great now. All right, so my question is related to kind of how landscape architects continue to break out of the traditional mold of what we do. And so I kind of want to know, how do we give our landscapes and design spaces a so what? So how can we as landscape architects become advocates for the environment and resilient design in a way that impacts the way communities perform, and not only the ways communities perform and are built, but also how do we start to change the kind of social sphere as, we'll continue to adapt to different resiliency techniques and continue to adapt to new guidelines that come out. But how do we as professionals really use our collaborative skills and our abilities that I think are pretty great and unique to the profession to start to change the way that people act and think to be in a more sustainable or a resilient kind of way?
So the question really has to do with the landscape architect as a little bit of a curator, then, would I be, and an advocate, not just organizing of information, but advocating for some better outcome. Yeah.
I mean, I think Chris touched on this a little bit already, and the term advocate or moderator, I think, is exactly a good term for what we can become as landscape architects. Is as we start to take on these bigger roles as the lead designer on this, whereas before the architect was, or the civil engineer was the main lead of these massive projects, we're able to start to see the much bigger picture and pull in, again, not feeling like we have to know everything, but we can pull in the expert on this portion, the expert on this portion, and begin to see how people can work together as a full-on team on that.
I think I would almost say that we, there are opportunities for being advocates, but it's maybe stronger to think that it's our responsibility to be advocates. And, I think that for the work of our firm, I think it is almost at every level of the practice. I think it's from, there's sort of embodied values about quality of space that come down to the details of the things that you make and the materials that you use. So I think there's embedded value in all of those decisions and a set of values that go into making those decisions. I think, more than that, I think we try to take on challenging issues, be they social and cultural, urban design related. There are a whole host, but I think, we do have this sort of unique set of tools and unique kind of convergence of disciplines And I think we have the vision to see things that maybe the general public doesn't see in terms of the value of these systems that affect our lives and that connect our potential to be resilient as a society. So I think for us, it's complex because we start with these deep histories and we kind of really dig in, and then we want those to be, that becomes a part of how we tell the story of the space, but it's not written on a panel when you walk into, a park or an urban plaza, but it has to be sort of embedded. And we do hope that there is some potential for that to become a part of what people know about the space too. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer, but.
Well, to your point about the environmental points of view, the role is to absolutely do it. I mean, my argument is only that it should be real, right? Because occasionally, sometimes, terminology gets misappropriated in a marketing sense. Because at the end of the day, you've got to get the gig, you've got to get people excited. I think that, there is a potential to paint a picture that people want to see resolved. That is real and still unique, and so in the sense that, like Spinal Tap, there's a fine line between stupid and clever, maybe here there's a fine line between audacious and reckless, right? That you need to go right up to the edge of that line to, rather than give people what they expected, which in some ways disappoints people, I think. You show them something that they didn't think was possible, and you've made them, as you've seen, through these various survey slides that have been shown today, this community engagement. I worked on a project up in Congress Square in Portland, Maine, and we took up a storefront for a week and just designed in a storefront where people were coming in and out for charrettes, and we were there for several days before we even started drawing, and people were into it and had like real things to contribute, and it was such an inclusionary experience that it was almost, for a New Yorker, it's like off-putting. It's like, wow, these people are really sensitive about each other's plights. This is amazing. But it was part of that energy that helped carry them forward, that made them want to make sure that what the design had promised became real. And they weren't just going to wait for it, that they were going to participate in the process to make it real. So I think that's it, that you become some kind of, it's not just a shepherd, it's sort of shepherd prophet, right? That you're going to be able to get someone to believe in a vision that you want to then pursue, where it might not have been your original interest to engage it in that way.
In my role at the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, I think one of the most common ways I interact with landscape architects, not being one, is in working with our planning department. And there's many landscape architects in that department, and I think one of their typical roles is not necessarily advocating for maybe it's also something that's deep within them, but they're advocates for the master plan, and they're speaking on behalf of the engagement that they have worked on throughout our city for one park, for an entire segment of our system. But that's one of the common ways, like I'm getting ready for our Arbor Day planting and working with our our planning staff, who's our landscape architects, is to say, hey, this is what the intentions were of this plan. Let's make sure we're respecting that, and so don't put trees there. We want other stuff, but it's on behalf of the community.
If I could just comment to
Just-
that.
Sure, and then we'll have a question at the front too.
If I could pipe in and just make my response to that question. I'm struck by remembering an exhibit that Peter Walker put together many years ago, where he took the face of the earth and broke it down into percentages, and then turned that into flats. Some of them had water, some of them had rock, some of them had agricultural crops in them. There were very few that were what we would call a garden, or an ornamental flower. And the point I think he was trying to make, and it was a good one, is there are only so many landscape architects and horticulturists and ecologists to go around, so we have to be very careful about and very pointed with how we approach making those changes in the landscape. And the more that can expand by the collaboration or you know, having a vision that somebody else picks up on that's not in the design fields, that expands the capabilities.
Thanks. Another question we had at the front.
Thank you all for being here and for all of your presentations. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it today. Is this on? Now it's on. So as we discuss each of your projects and the state of the profession and how we're entering uncharted territory, I think this aspect of reflection and evaluation, self-evaluation, which some of you have been touching on so far, I think is really critical in order to provide a feedback loop for all of our professions. And so I guess I sort of have a two-part question. One being, if you were to do your project again, are there things that you would do differently? And you know, now sort of like as a post-occupancy or post-construction type of lessons learned, how would you approach future projects differently?
Great question. Carrying the lessons learned forward. If you had the do-over, and then how does that affect future practice?
I would have loved to have been a part of the design process. I wasn't there for it, so that'd be one thing. But and we're starting to do more of that in our office internally with just sort of internal QA/QC things, where me, who am primarily in the field doing construction administration, I'm now overseeing a lot of the design documents as they hit 100% SD and now through 100% CD. So it's an exciting thing for our office that we're doing now. But as far as the what we would do different, I touched base a little bit on Nicolette at the end of my presentation, that we saw about a 20% mortality rate on Nicolette for the trees, and then there was a pretty significant amount of herbaceous layer that was lost as well. Part of that is still really unknown as to what was the overall cause. We saw things from over-irrigating because of the different soils of the root ball to the sand-based soil, engineered soil that we had on the project, where they were irrigating and over-irrigating, and when you hit field capacity of a sand-based soil, it completely flushes out. So then they would test the soil, and it would, you know, there'd be low moisture levels in that sand-based soil. Well, they weren't ever testing the root ball itself, which had a higher clay content, was holding water, and so that was one aspect. One of the other aspects was potential species selection during the phase, which, you know, if we would have had maybe a little more collaboration with the urban forestry department, if that planning review was a little more formalized, you know, maybe that would have changed some of that. Not to say that we didn't, because we did reach out to professionals on that and expertise, our local landscape architect, in particular the birch species, and our local landscape architect had a project right on the northern end of the library, right along the mall, where they had birch trees, and they were successful, still are. So we are seeing different things, different angles, different thoughts on that species as a very hard plant to plant in an urban environment. There was, you know, weather's harsh in Minneapolis all the time, but in speaking with Craig Pincala with the urban forestry department there, you know, he went through a series with us. He reviewed and evaluated the trees after the fact, and essentially shared that there was some weather anomalies that happened aside from, you know, your typical Minnesota weather that had impact on trees throughout the region as well, which damaged budding early on in the winter, and then some other late season things that happened that damaged the budding as well. So that was another potential. And then we also saw a heavy amount of salt put on this project because of just the Super Bowl was that that following January, right after all this planting happened. So they made a big push to get all the plant material in. And then the Super Bowl essentially came in and took over the Nicollet Mall for a month. And they got a lot of snow during that month, and they put down a lot of salt. So that was maybe one other factor. And then we also had birch and oak trees that are fall plant hazards, out of spec. We're planted out of spec, trying to meet a deadline. Or it wasn't meeting a deadline. It was trying to meet the Super Bowl sort of expectation. We had initially had those scheduled to be planted the following spring, but we didn't want the owner didn't want to have these big gaping holes in the landscape, and big event coming to the city. So there was a number of things that we looked at throughout this evaluation period last year, and we had to take a step back and, well, are we going to come back and plant more birch trees on this project, right? And so we had to go through this whole, again, sort of evaluation process on, well, if we planted them again and they weren't successful again, it would just be a completely horrible situation to be in. So, we looked to reusing some of the species that we had already on the mall. We looked at different species that we, I mentioned the honey locust, where we had initially had those out of the plan, and we ended up bringing a few in on this redesign, essentially, of what will be planted this spring. So yeah, we had to look at it and kind of take a gut check on our own, and just it was a big learning lesson, especially for me. Again, not being a big plant guy in general, and then having all this come about over the last year. It's been a big learning curve for myself. So
next time when we are forced to get trees in the ground in time for a winter event, let's collaborate with an artist just to get some tree idea structures into those holes, like the annuals that your project worked with.
Well, maybe not like that.
Well, yeah,
maybe an artist.
Matt, you've got something to weigh in on.
Well, I was just going to say, for us, I think, especially on a project this large, there are definitely things we would change. We had some irrigation issues. I know sequence, schedule, timing, again, trying to meet a deadline was a big push. But kind of on every job, if you're not learning, if there's not something you do different, you're not really growing as a person. So I think every job you're on, it's good to kind of reflect and look at what you would change and how do you fix that going forward. So I think that's something that makes us a better contractor, and I would assume on the landscape architecture side makes a better landscape architect, just constantly trying to evolve and change.
Yeah, I think just following up on that, we actually have a trip planned for about 20 or 25 people from MBVA, and we're going out to Tulsa next month. And it's not a trip, pat yourself on the back trip, I can assure you that. It's really to try to take a hard look at what was done and what could be done better. Everything down from construction detailing to larger sort of planning moves and site grading and all the things that kind of impact us every day. So the second thing to answer your question is, so we had to work with the Army Corps of Engineers on the Tulsa project, right? There's a tremendous amount of fill placed in the river, and that's not it's not typically an easy permit to get. And I think our team did a good job in preparing the package and everything and meeting with them, but it was pretty easy, and I don't know why it's not that easy in other jurisdictions, right? Why we get so bogged down in policy, and I think that is something that landscape architects should be more involved in terms of like, how do decisions get made? Like, how annoying is it when a master plan sits on the shelf for 20 years and there's no action behind it? I mean, it's just, so I think policy making and things like that, and just taking a harder look at what government bodies have been more successful than others in getting things passed, and Toronto's been pretty progressive in that regard. And I think some of this too, with like assigning deadlines for when money has to be spent to get actionable work going, is pretty effective.
Actually, I think the Toronto client for MVVA on the waterfront, together with MVVA, actually created a new set of planting guidelines that the city has now adopted, probably pushed by MVVA, actually, for Corktown Commons on the waterfront. Yeah. So that's an example of an experiment, really, in policy and governance. I'm observing that I don't think there are any planners here right now, are there? Can you raise your hand if you identify as a planner? Besides me. I think they're all in another lecture, actually, hearing a good friend of mine, I think, colleague from planning. So maybe that's why there are no planners in the room to help us out with that. But I did notice that we haven't heard so much from the science end of the table, and we do have a fluvial geomorphologist, hydrogeomorphologist here, as well as an ecologist, ornithologist maybe? Is that right? Ecologist. So, you know, there's been a theme that you're learning through practice, you're expanding the boundaries, and I think this is really about monitoring and evaluation, because we can't learn in a formal way. We can all learn personally through experience what we would do better, how we would grow as an individual professional. But in the world of the academy and in scholarship, we grow through monitoring and evaluation and writing that up in a scientific format like you guys are familiar with in your everyday work. Landscape architects don't always have a canon of doing that in the same way. And so maybe one of the aspects of the kind of collaboration we've been hearing about today are opportunities for more formalized monitoring and evaluation of projects. You guys know where I'm going with this, because it's never built into the budget, so I'm looking at the landscape architects. No one is paying you to do monitoring and evaluation. Not your problem, right? So when those trees die, you don't exactly know. It could be cumulative effects, it could be one thing or 3 variables or 10 variables or bad decision making or timing of the budget. No one's doing this in a formal way. So we have an opportunity here in the academy, given that we're sitting in a university where we're talking about the nexus of these kinds of information. Let's think about how we set up designs for conditions with high risk, high uncertainty, under resilience, where we really need to think about our designs as kinds of experiments that when they fail safely. And if we're not allowed to talk about them failing, then we talk about them learning. So I wonder if you have some insights to offer. I'm looking at the science guys down at the end of the table first, but maybe in our audience there are also folks who've got some ideas about how we might become better at formalizing the good science methods of tracking information, monitoring and evaluation in a formalized way, but in a way that allows designers also to be a little bit more, what was that term, dancing between audaciousness and recklessness, doing a little experimentation on the fly. I really like that, because I actually think there is a sweet spot for resilience somewhere in that middle ground. So how can we design experiments that are allowed some flexibility? And we might talk about that from the procurement point of view, or we might talk about it from the science point of view, because you are in a really unique spot here, I think, at the university to think about that. Any thoughts?
So yeah, a little bit on both edges of that. So with the procurement side of it is setting it up on the front end. And this speaks to the previous question too, is kind of fighting for what's important. As a consultant, it's not our money. And that's kind of the tricky part, is you got to play the balance, keep your client happy because you have to get paid and you have to meet their goals. But if you know it's important and you're the specialist and they're coming to you, you need to tell them that it's important, like monitoring, like maybe in the case of the trees, like soil monitoring, like you go in for 3 years before the project, you go in and monitor pH or whatever it is you would do. But like specifically to my project and leading the front of the discipline, and so sediment transport, it's voodoo. Like I studied engineering and I ended up in fluvial geomorphology because it's kind of an art more than it is like, here's your number. So monitor and monitor and monitor the system to know while you're doing these offline calculations that you're in the ballpark. Like to go into the no regrets part from the previous question, or have some regrets, would be I would have stopped studying this 5 years prior and just went and started putting stuff in the river and documented the living snot out of it. Exactly. I mean, we're getting different numbers every time we're running these equations, and you're like, well, let's do it. And then see where that falls out and try to find a better way to quantify it, or essentially push the discipline. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but...
Speculation, right? This is really about collective speculation. What can you do? I think we know that you can't say about a park, I'm like, who am I looking at now with the really expensive parks, all of you. Those are not experiments that can fail publicly. But the little pockets within them could be seen as experiments that evolve over time with good monitoring and evaluation, with protocols that are shared by our friends in the sciences, for example, or in the appropriate disciplines. They're not always sciences.
Yeah,
So I'm
don't
really
be
asking
afraid
you
to
speculate.
take an informed risk, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Informed risk is another good way of putting it.
We're fortunate in Minneapolis. You know, Nicollet Mall is like 273 or something, like almost 300 trees. 240. Hi. There's 200,000 street trees in Minneapolis. There's another 55,000 parkland trees and, 400,000 woodland trees. We have a formal research partnership with the University of Minnesota. And so when we have something we're trying to figure out, we're invested long term into this system, and we put money into their budget to do research with us collaboratively. And when we have questions about what's going to come out of this, what's happening, there are locations where we're not, testing in the middle of Nicollet Mall might be cool if we're trying to show people science as an engagement project, but might not be the spot for something to fail, as you're talking. But there are places for that.
And to go back to the tree topic on Nicollet, I mean, we did do a mock-up on site where we wanted to see not only how well the contractor would appeal to the constructability of the grove area, but having the birch tree on site with sort of the scrutiny that we were getting along the way, we wanted to get one out on site and do that. And so we actually planted one the previous year and planted it in the fall because we understood that was the possibility that was going to happen. And what we saw was that actually thrived that following year. And so, we saw it living well, doing very, very well. And then that following year, when all of these other trees died after everything else was installed, we saw failure on that one as well. So, that's a very small scale sort of research mock-up scenario, but, it failed us on this case, I guess, but, it was something that we were invested in trying and seeing and trying to figure that out before the full-on installation of the project.
So time scale matters. And you don't always know which one you're using for which variable, right?
We actually have started doing voluntary visits to projects that have long been completed just to see how they've evolved, and we do it complimentary just because really it's mostly for us in terms of a feedback loop and how the things that you put into the ground, that was one of the things talking with Patrick about our role as designers. We try our best to imagine these dynamic landscapes in their full cycles, but we kind of see it in one moment, and then, and so, especially I guess when they're private, you don't have the opportunity to go back. So depending on where it is and how much access you have to it, the Highline, you're able to walk it as much as you want. But so that's one way that we've intentionally, and it's a benefit to them because if there are problems or things they want to talk about and tell us about. But then on a bunch of our conservation agriculture projects, we've built in, from a scientific standpoint, monitoring as a part of different practices in terms of meadow management or reforestation practices. So trying to build that into our process as much as we can, we do. And then I think somewhat in terms of the idea of these, let's call it a management manual now instead of a maintenance manual, but and this horticultural position, it's about how is it going to evolve and who will be there to be a part of that. And I think that, advocating for that and for the client to be thinking about it on day one and not feeling like they've delivered a complete thing, but knowing that it's something that will evolve and will need to be, something that you engage with for the rest of its life.
Something also relative to this is that I noticed at the latest ASL thing is the sort of potential of citizen science. Sort of now that instead of the professional professionals to do it, as opposed to the ability of looking at strategies for using citizen science and social media as a way of having a better sense of the pulse of how the landscape is going. It seems to be a pretty interesting trajectory that's starting to emerge.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to do that, a real valuation of your own work, I mean, there's some confidence that's involved in that, right? That because you're gonna, you may uncover something that's not going to be pleasant, but there is, I think, a functional integrity to that approach. If you're, in the case of Nelson Waltz, they asked me last summer or the summer before to go to one of their first designs, which had things that were starting to senesce a little bit, or things that are kind of like working their way out, or conditions that were changing and they wanted to adapt it. And they just wanted a different set of eyes and were comfortable with any way that the conversation went out. In the same way that what you were just talking about, that you guys are going to go back and really kind of evaluate what that is. Because if you don't do that with any level of real honesty, you can't, it's like that the Einstein quote that the problems aren't solved by the level of thinking that created them. You're just kind of in this loop where it's like, well, I don't know what happened. Well, good luck next time, And when the answer would be clear to maybe anybody else who is looking at it from a different perspective. So there are real reasons why, decisions are made, and there are real pressures associated with all of these projects and interventions. And maybe the answer is, well, it's just a matter of saying something different at a different point, or handling it a different way, or addressing something, and you're gonna find that out if you really get into it. But you have to want to know what happened, right?
You have to use your own.
All right. I think it's on now. Hello. I'm really interested in going back and looking at some of the play environments that we've made over the years. I think that, especially now being a father of two and having created play spaces before being a father, and now going back and looking at some of those and like, oh my God, what are you doing? But no, it's a fun time. Not only do you get to see the kids enjoying the space or not enjoying the space, but I think there's a different perspective about now this accommodation for parents and their comfort, and because they're only going to be in that play space as long as the parents are comfortable, and some really practical things like that have kind of helped. We used to do this evaluation of a playground every spring, free of charge, after the project was completed, and I would go back and it'd take a week or so to kind of get all the notes together and photos and say, hey, you guys should really do this. And one year I just didn't get to it. It was spring, it was busy, and the client emailed and she's like, where's the report? And I was like, well, we're doing this on good faith, but it's helpful. I mean, if you're not going back and revisiting your own or being critical of your own work, then I think you're kind of getting left behind. And even better when you can have a group to point out things that could have been done better.
I do notice that the metal slides that are in Corktown Common are now shaded in the image you showed me.
That is
must
true.
have been some learning.
North facing
going on.
and shaded.
North facing and shaded. Well done. Well done. What a lovely conversation. I feel like we're just beginning to get into some of the really nitty-gritty of the collaboration that we've been talking about. But I said that I also knew that the only thing standing between you and that first cocktail of your weekend is us. So with that, we're coming to the end of our conversation time. But I thought that I would go a little off-road here and say, before everybody's allowed to go, I need to hear one word that sums up resilience, the nexus of resilience. You don't have to think about it, just go. I'm looking right at you because you're at the end of the table. You get to start. Give us one word for what you've heard this day.
Exciting.
Exciting, good, that's one word. Don't think, just go. Just has to pop in your head there.
Creativity. Vital.
Dialogue.
Opportunity.
Opportunity.
You were gonna say beaver.
Beaver, yeah. Opportunity, I had opportunity.
Collaboration.
Okay, I'm gonna say, creative, being creative.
Inspired. Thank you all very much, and thanks for having us.